Giannis was 7 years old, and 7 was just old enough to know that the world should bend to him. He was an only child, and his parents, after years of wishing for just one, had given him everything. If he wanted the new toy, he got it. If he demanded another hour on the tablet, it was granted. If he raised his voice in the supermarket, the tantrum ended with something sweet in his hands. He was the kind of boy who thought rules were flexible, meals were negotiable, and bedtime was always someone else's problem. His parents told themselves it was a phase. They were busy, after all, both working long hours in the city, coming home too tired to fight him every night. It was easier to give in, easier to tell him yes. But summer was different. That year, his grandparents had insisted. They hadn't seen him in too long, they said. The boy was growing, and they didn't want to be strangers when he came of age. His grandmother's voice on the phone had been soft but firm. Send him. Just for the summer, he should know the village, know his roots. So his parents agreed. Perhaps distance would do him good. Perhaps time in the countryside, without screens, without malls, without constant noise, would quiet him down. Perhaps the village could teach him what they could not. And so Giannis arrived at a place that felt like the opposite of everything he knew. The road to the village wound past endless fields and olive groves, sun-bleached and swaying in the heat. The air itself felt lighter, buzzing with cicadas, different in his lungs. The houses were low, whitewashed, their roofs red with age, their walls cracked by years of sun and rain. His grandparents' home stood at the edge of the fields, shaded by old cypress trees. The courtyard smelled of figs drying in the sun and bread baking in the clay oven. Inside, the rooms were cool and tidy, their shelves lined with jars of olives and honey, bundles of thyme and rosemary hanging near the kitchen window. For Giannis's grandparents, his visit was no small thing. They had insisted. They wanted him to know the place where his father had grown, to taste the food of the land, to learn its rhythm. His grandmother cooked him local delights: honey cakes, warm bread, chicken roasted with preserved lemon. She pressed him to taste figs still warm from the sun, dates soft and sweet. His grandfather, patient and smiling, took him through the groves, showing him how to care for the olive trees, how to feed the goats, how to lead them back before dusk. They tried to interest him in the countryside, in the simple magic of it, stories told under starlight, the smell of rain on dry earth, the hum of life lived slower but fuller. But none of it mattered to Giannis. The food was strange. The goats smelled. The olive trees were boring. What he wanted was noise and screens, toys that flashed and buzzed. To him, this wasn't adventure. It was punishment. By the second day, his boredom had soured into tantrums. He pushed away plates of food, turned chores into battles, mocked the neighbors' children when they offered him a ball of rags to play with. He wasn't just restless. He was cruel. His parents sighed, too tired to correct him, relieved to let his grandparents try. His grandfather kept patient, though the lines on his face deepened when Giannis stomped away. And his grandmother, she never raised her voice. She just watched him closely, with the quiet weight of someone who had seen children like him before. It happened after another tantrum. That evening, his grandmother had laid the table with care. Steaming soup, bread hot from the oven, honey dripping from combs she'd cut that morning. Giannis wrinkled his nose at all of it, muttering that it wasn't real food. When she offered him figs from the tree in the courtyard, he threw his plate down hard enough that it split into pieces on the stone floor. The silence that followed was heavier than scolding. His grandfather sighed and carried on eating, but his grandmother only looked at Giannis, long, steady, as if weighing him. Later, when the lamps were lit and the night air cooled, she found him sulking in the courtyard. She sat beside him, folding her shawl tight across her shoulders. For a moment she said nothing. The cicadas outside droned. Then her voice came low, even. "Do you know why children here listen to their elders?" Giannis didn't answer. He kicked at the dirt with his heel, waiting for another lecture. But his grandmother's tone was different. It wasn't sharp. It was calm, too calm. Because once, long ago, there was a man who carried a sack. That caught his attention. His eyes flicked to hers, curious despite himself. She leaned closer, her voice lowering into a whisper. "He walks at night. Always at night. Through villages, through fields. His sack is never empty, though no one knows how. Inside it's heavy and it moves. He takes the children who don't listen, the greedy, the cruel, the ones who mock their elders. He puts them in his sack, and by dawn, they're gone. Yanis blinked. Gone where? His grandmother's eyes didn't move from his. No one knows. That's the point. Once you're in the sack, you don't come back out. The cicadas fell quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then went silent. Yanis forced a laugh, thin and nervous. That's just a story. His grandmother didn't smile. Stories don't last this long if they're only stories. She stood, leaving him there with the night pressing close, the words settling into him like dust. Yanis shook his head, muttering to himself. He didn't believe in monsters with sacks. He was 7, not a baby. And yet, when the wind shifted and dragged across the stones, he could have sworn it sounded like something heavy being pulled. For 2 days, Yanis behaved, at least on the surface. He ate what was put in front of him, carried a small basket when asked, even kicked a ball with the neighbor's children once. His parents praised him. His grandmother only watched. But obedience never sat long with him. By the 3rd night, boredom gnawed at him like hunger. The stories, the chores, the endless quiet of the countryside, he hated all of it. And worst of all was the way his grandmother's words lingered. The man with the sack. It followed him into his dreams, into the stillness between the cypress trees. So when the house went quiet after supper and his parents' voices dimmed behind the bedroom door, Yanis slipped outside. The courtyard was silver in the moonlight. Beyond the low wall, the fields stretched out, dark rows of wheat and beans, dotted with olive trees. His grandparents had warned him more than once. Never wander into the neighbor's land at night. Show respect. The fields are not yours, which of course made him grin. He climbed the wall and dropped into the furrows, the dirt cool beneath his feet. He darted between stalks, snapped a few just to hear them crack, then tore handfuls of beans and tossed them aside. When he reached the olives, he plucked one and bit into it, spitting it sour into the soil. See? He whispered to no one. Nothing. But the silence that followed was not the silence of night. It was heavier, waiting. Yanis shoved his hands into his pockets, walking further than he meant to, crunching stalks under his shoes. He imagined his grandmother's frown, her voice telling that story again, and laughed under his breath. And then he froze. A sound, a drag, slow, heavy, as if something enormous was being pulled through the dirt. He stopped, breath caught in his chest. The sound came again, closer. He spun, but the path behind him was empty. Only broken stalks, his own footprints. The air shifted, the night colder, the fields too still. He saw it then, pressed faintly into the dirt, lit by the thin wash of moonlight, a footprint, too large to be his, and beside it, the deep round imprint of something heavy. Yanis's throat went dry, his flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam jittering over stalks and stones. The dragging came again, longer, closer. And this time there was another sound with it, a faint rustle, like something shifting inside fabric. Yanis lifted the light. At first it caught only dust, then the edge of a shape, a curve of cloth, burlap, rough and torn, sagging under its own weight. The sack. It was enormous, almost as tall as he was, slung across the back of something. Someone, moving slowly between the olive trees. The figure was hunched, shoulders broad, wrapped in tattered cloth the color of earth. The sack dragged across the soil behind him, twisting, twitching, as though whatever was inside it was not entirely still. Yanis couldn't breathe. He tried to convince himself it was a farmer, someone carrying grain late at night. But the figure turned, just slightly, and the light caught its face. Or rather, what should have been a face. Skin stretched too thin, eyes black, reflecting the beam like glass. A mouth that did not open but curved into something that might have been a smile. And then it spoke, not aloud, not with lips, but inside Yanis's chest, deep as a whisper carried by earth. In the sack, boy, in the sack with the others. The sack thumped once against the ground, as though something inside had struck from within. Yanis staggered back, his voice finally breaking free in a scream. His flashlight beam jerking wildly across the rows of crops. The figure kept coming, slow, deliberate, dragging that enormous sack behind him. Each pull left grooves in the dirt, each step pressed deeper than the last. The sack twitched again, a muffled thud, like fists pounding from inside. Yanis's stomach flipped. No, he gasped, shaking his head as though the word could undo the moment. No, you're not real. The man tilted his head, eyes glinting black in the moonlight. The sack lifted slightly, though no hand touched it. The mouth of it sagged open, yawning wide enough to swallow a child whole. In the sack, boy? The whisper filled Yanis's skull, pushing out every thought but one: run. And he did. He bolted through the fields, stalks snapping underfoot, breath tearing at his throat. Behind him, the drag followed, steady, relentless, the scrape of burlap against soil. He didn't dare look back, didn't dare see how close it was. The sound was enough. The low wall of the courtyard came into view. His legs burned as he hurled himself at it, scrambling up, scraping his knees raw as he pulled over the top and crashed hard into the yard. He spun, chest heaving, expecting to see the figure climbing after him. But the fields were empty, only the furrows he had trampled, only the swaying of wheat in the breeze. And faintly, almost kindly, the last sound of burlap being dragged back into the dark. Yanis collapsed against the wall, shaking, tears streaking his face. He didn't call out, he didn't dare. Yanis slipped back into the house without a sound. His knees were raw, his palms scraped, his chest still heaving with sobs he couldn't let out. He crawled under the heavy quilt his grandmother had laid out for him and pulled it over his head, shivering until exhaustion finally dragged him into uneasy sleep. At dawn, the smell of bread and honey filled the kitchen. His grandmother didn't mention the mud on his pajamas, or the dirt under his nails, or the way his eyes darted to the window every time the wind shifted. She only set a bowl in front of him and said quietly, "You went into the fields." Yanis stared at the table, unable to answer, his throat clenched shut. His grandmother's gaze lingered a moment longer, then she nodded, as if some unspoken truth had been confirmed. "You understand now. That was all. No scolding, no story, no warning, just those words." From that morning on, Yanis was different. He ate what was given. He kept quiet during chores. He never mocked the neighbors' children again. When night fell, he stayed close to the lamplight, refusing to even glance toward the dark fields beyond the wall. And sometimes, when the house was still and everyone else was asleep, he swore he could hear it, that slow, steady drag, the rustle of a sack pulled across the dirt, waiting.